Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Munich. It's a special pleasure because Richard Musgrave was my professor in public finance at Harvard. So I learned public finance from him. And it's also a special pleasure to be here today because Mike is my great friend, and I couldn't be more happy than to laudate, if that is an English word, for Mike. I want to tell you how I met Mike, and I think Mike knows I'm going to tell this story. He knows I love this story. I met Mike about 30 years ago in Reykjavik at a conference in Iceland, and for one of the dinners we went to a restaurant at the top of maybe the tallest building in Reykjavik at the time, 6 floors, and at the top there was a restaurant that revolved. And so that was a topic of conversation and led to one thing or another, at which point Mike said he had an idea for a cheap way to see the world. He would, you go up in a balloon, just stay up there and just let the world pass below you, and you could see the whole world. Very cheap. And I said to Mike, Mike, I hadn't met him before, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and I predict we're going to be great friends forever. Now, Mike hasn't yet conceded on the first. I asked him for a citation just a few days ago. He did not send me one. But I think, and I hope Mike would agree, that the second prediction has turned out to be true. So I met Mike about 1988. Mike visited at the University of Michigan, where I am, for about 6 months in 1995. And I did a sabbatical term at Oxford, where Mike is, in the summer and fall of 2014. So what I want to do is just give you a sense of the kinds of projects, research Mike works on. He mostly works on corporate taxation. He has worked on what are the factors that influence the locational decisions of multinational firms, and has used the theoretical model to explain the pattern of investment across Europe of U.S. firms investing in the European market, and came to a somewhat surprising conclusion that the effective average tax rate on investment of these U.S. firms played a role in the choice between European locations, but not in the choice of whether the U.S. multinationals should locate in Europe compared to some other place. Mike has worked a lot on international tax competition, and one of his prominent papers analyzes the development of taxes on corporate income in the European Union and G7 countries over the last 2 decades of the 20th century. And the paper established a number of stylized facts, which I think now are the accepted wisdom about what was happening in corporate taxes starting in about 1980. That if the taxes especially on profitable investments, have fallen continuously from at least 1980 to 2000 and continued after. But the paper didn't just establish the facts. It investigated some competing explanations for why this might have been happening. It could have been that governments were responding to a fall in the cost of shifting income across countries, and then responding by making sure their statutory corporate tax rates were not above the average of others, which would induce income shifting out. Or reforms were consistent with competition for more profitable projects of multinationals, so about really the location of investment as opposed to the location of taxable profits. Which that line of reasoning led to a paper, a very widely cited and influential paper, called Do Countries Compete Over Corporate Tax Rates? And I think now, in large part because of Mike and his colleagues' work, we know the answer is yes, they do. And in this paper, Mike and his co-authors investigate whether OECD countries compete with each other over corporation taxes, and how important that is to explaining the phenomenon of declining statutory tax rates. And the paper takes the stance that multinational firms choose 2 important things. They choose where to locate their capital stock, and where to locate their profits. So this is a theme in Mike's work, that corporations are doing both, and governments are competing in competition over two things. They're competing over the effective marginal tax rate on investment to try to get investment to come to their country. And they're also competing over the statutory rate on profits because of the impact of that on where taxable profit is located. And like in most of Mike's papers, it doesn't stop at a theoretical model, but then looks at data to try to make sense of which of these factors are most important. And the paper finds, consistent with the model in this paper, but not every model you might read, that there is evidence of strategic interaction among countries, but interestingly only for open economies, meaning those without capital controls in place. And the paper concludes that the reduction in tax rates can be explained almost entirely by more intense competition generated by the relaxation of capital controls, which happened about at the beginning of the period that he's studying. The last of many, many papers I could have chosen to talk about, that I want to talk about, I've chosen because it played a pretty big role in the recent US debate about reforming our tax system. So I'm sure most of you followed that we had a tax reform. We have a new income tax law as of January 1st, and one of the things it features is a cut in the corporate tax rate from a top rate of 35% to a flat rate of 21%. This was clearly the centerpiece of the tax reform, although it did many, many other things, and was clearly the most controversial aspect of it. Some of the proponents of this argued that although it may look like cutting the corporate tax rate so much would benefit mostly high-income shareholders, in fact, it would benefit ultimately workers. And the mechanism that many of the supporters had in mind was that you lower the corporate tax rate, there's more business investment, eventually there's more of a bigger capital stock, which makes workers more productive, and in a competitive labor market, wages will go up. Well, I think that was 5 steps. And each of those is subject to empirical analysis. But the paper that Mike had written, one of the papers that Mike had written, which was cited often in this debate, was a model of the more direct effect of corporate income taxes on wages. And in the paper, they have a bargaining framework between the owners of corporations and the workers, and test the model on cross-company variation in tax liabilities. So what's the relationship between a company's tax liability and the wages they pay to their employees? And here is the bottom line. And this was quoted a lot in the last year in the US. An exogenous rise of $1 in corporate tax reduces the wage bill by 49 cents. So I'm going to now turn it around and say it in the way we heard it in the US. Every $1 cut in the corporate tax liability would increase wages paid by 49 cents. So about half of the corporate tax cut would redound, not ultimately, but more quickly, to the benefit of workers. Well, in the United States, that is political dynamite. It was, anyway, and was quite influential. So I've only given you a taste of the many, many important academic papers that Mike has written, and most of them concern corporate income taxes. When I thought of how focused Mike has been in his research, it reminded me of another famous Oxford professor other than Mike, Isaiah Berlin, the political philosopher, who talked about the difference between a hedgehog and a fox. You probably know the metaphor. A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one very important thing. Well, I think Mike's academic research, in his academic research, he's been a hedgehog. I remember it was about 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, Mike said to me at one point, I really got to study something else. I got to think about something other than corporate taxes. And I knew he wasn't going to do it. So in one way, Mike is a hedgehog. He has had laser-like focus on understanding this incredibly important topic of the impact of corporate taxes. But in another way, actually, Mike is a fox. Why is he a fox? Not so much because he knows many things, which he does, but that's not what I mean, but because he does many things. I've already talked about the fact that he writes seminal economic papers, but also he runs the leading academic center that is focused on business taxation. That's the Oxford University Center for Business Taxation. He was the first and has been the only director of the Center for Business Taxation. It came into existence in November 2005 and somehow managed to stay in existence for a few months before Mike became the director in September 1st, 2006. I was actually there at the launch conference in March of 2006. I'm sure many of you have been at the events of CBT, the academic symposium, the summer conference, the topical conferences on business tax issues of the day. Many of you have probably been visiting scholars there or graduate students there. So Mike is a fox because he writes seminal economic papers, academic papers. He runs the most important and influential shop in business tax. And third, he doesn't only write academic papers. He works on concrete proposals to improve countries' tax systems. A lot of academics write academic papers, but don't bother to take the time to say, all right, I learned all this. What does it mean about what our tax system should be? So, which brings me to the last subject that Mike has worked on most recently, and that is to develop and try to convince people of the merits of what is just beautifully, mellifluously named the destination-based cash flow tax, the DBCFT. It just doesn't have the nice acronym that the value-added tax has, but it is something worth thinking about. So Mike has spent a lot of time the last few years explaining to people how it works, trying to convince people that judged against the criteria we usually use for judging tax systems, efficiency, robustness to evasion and avoidance, ease of administration, fairness, and stability, the DBCFT is worth taking seriously. And it was taken seriously in the United States for 2 or 3 months. And it didn't make it into our new tax law, but it had a serious airing, and serious in the sense that I think every time now there's a major tax reform in a major country, this will be a contender, and maybe someday we will see it. I think it also taught us how much farther we economists have to go in educating the population about taxation, because the debate in the United States was just filled with misunderstandings about taxes like the DBCFT. So Mike is a hedgehog in his focus on corporate taxes, but he is a fox in that he has done brilliant academic work. He has established the CBT at Oxford, and he has spent a lot of his time trying to get countries to think about, and maybe someday to adopt, tax systems which will make them better off. So I am very much looking forward, Mike, to hear what you have to say. And I would like to close by saying that you're a fox and a hedgehog, and most of all, I am lucky to also call you a good friend.
Now I'll need both of you, Joel, for the photo mostly. Do you wanna read this and hand it over?
Okay. All right. Well, on behalf of the International Institute of Public Finance and CESifo, I'm pleased to give you this document which establishes that you are now the Richard Musgrave Lecture Visiting Professor of 2018. It's awarded jointly by CESifo Group and IIPF. And both Clemens and I have signed it, and it's a pleasure to give this to you.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. We do a photo. We do a photo in front of the